Tonight we're going to take a look at why was a biblical theory that makes accurate predictions ignored for decades? You know, that's a tough one, and I've been asking that a lot. And we're going to take a look at some of the documents that might explain some of that. But first, let's get you up to speed on what's happening just recently. I just listened to this a few hours ago. They flipped the new dietary guidelines for Americans. That food pyramid has been tipped on its head. Yeah, and so they want you to have a lot of protein, dairy, healthy fats, and vegetables and fruits. And then way at the bottom, they want you to have whole grain. Okay, so that's changed, and it says they say avoid highly processed, packaged, prepared, ready to eat, or other foods that are salty or sweet, such as chips, cookies, and candy that have added sugars and sodium. And then it doesn't say cut down on stuff, reduce it. This is what it says. While no amount of added sugar or non-nutritional sweeteners is recommended. So 0, okay? Or considered part of a healthy or nutritious diet, one meal should contain no more than 10 grams of added sugar, which is like a fourth of a can of pop. So this is what they've said. And then just earlier this week, that I got off the high wire just a few hours ago. Okay, a few days ago, the CDC removed 6 diseases from the childhood vaccine schedule because Trump wanted us to compare ourselves with the European countries. And so now we're following more like Denmark. Instead of having 53 shots by the time a kid votes, it's going down to 23. So they're reducing that. And the ones they're not recommending anymore is the RSV, the meningococcal, the hepatitis A and hepatitis B. And they're also not recommending the flu, COVID-19, and rotavirus. People can still get them. It'll still be paid for by insurance, but that's not on the recommended schedule. And that's what some schools are using. They've tried to mandate that. But in every state, you have a religious exemption. There are exemptions in every state except for 5. It's like California, New York, Connecticut, West Virginia. That one's still in the court. Oh, and then if you go into cdc.gov, you'll notice and search autism and vaccines. It says that the claim vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim because studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines cause autism. And it says studies supporting a link have been ignored by health authorities. But when you go into there, you still see it. Vaccines do not cause autism with an asterisk. So let's go down and see what the asterisk means. The header, vaccines do not cause autism, has not been removed due to an agreement with the chair of the U.S. Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee that it would remain on the CDC website. So this is not science that it's there. There's some agreement that it's there. Okay, so I just thought I'd get you up to speed on that because the mainstream media is not real fired up about talking about that. Okay, so I'll get you up to speed on what I've been doing since I spoke last in November. I spoke on Thursday, and then Monday night I had a debate with a paleontologist about the origin of Grand Canyon. And that was so much fun. And there's a reason people don't want to debate that, because there's some answers that they can't answer. And then this person commented, it's so obvious how Grand Canyon was formed, and it's almost nauseating and embarrassing to listen to a secularist try to explain it. Yeah, it's a lot of just so stories. And when you go into the Grand Canyon's website on the National Park Service, they've got 4 theories and none of them work. And I submitted Walt Brown's hydroplate theory one and that one, but they haven't put it up yet. But it's going to get there. And so that was Monday night. Tuesday morning, I went to Bethel, and I'm trying to get a creation club going there. And the question of the day was, will the hydroplate theory destroy the Big Bang? So everybody comes up and says, well, what's the hydroplate theory? So then I take 15 minutes and I get them up to speed. And so, yeah, it's a good one. And then Tuesday night, I'm the guy recording the Twin Cities Creation Science Association speaker. And then that got done around 9 or 10. And instead of driving home up 94 so I can get up in the morning and get back into that traffic again, I just headed to Iowa. And Wednesday night I spoke at a church. And then Thursday I had a booth or a table at Faith Bible Baptist College in Ankeny. I want to get a creation club going there. And I was there on Friday. And then Friday night I had an exhibit at the Reclaim Your Health conference. And so I was able to listen to doctors and hear a lot of that stuff. And then I got home on Sunday and had a week to figure out how to live stream this event. December 1 to 6, there's a Hydroplate Theory Week of Celebration. We had about 15 interviews that we were going to play in the evenings, and I had to figure out how to live stream it. And it was didn't go exactly right like I wanted to. I had to rebuild a YouTube channel to make it work, but we made it work. And so you can see some of these interviews that we live streamed, and people came in after the interviews. That was a lot of fun. But since I was so busy with that, I didn't get to do what my favorite thing to do. Go to St. Cloud State in December and play them Christmas carols and wish them Merry Christmas. You know, I love to do that, and I could only do it once this year, and I'm doing it, and security comes up to me and asks, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm exercising my First Amendment freedom of speech rights that I have that are guaranteed by the Constitution." And they said, "Well, we got a call on you." And I said, "Well, did you tell the caller that free speech is for speech you disagree with?" And they said, "Well, is that your bag over there? Because there's snow everywhere, and my bag's up by the Husky there just off of the frame." And I said, "Yeah, that's my bag." And he says, "Can we look through it?" And I asked him, "Well, did I commit a crime?" And then the other security guy said, "No, we don't have to look through it." And I said, this would all, if we had indoor free speech kiosks, this wouldn't be a problem. Just let us have a voice on campus. Taxpayers are funding this. If they don't have an indoor voice, they shouldn't have to fund it. You shouldn't get our money. And I said, why don't you run that up the flagpole and make everybody's job a lot easier, and you won't get calls about bags by the snow. But then they went, so that's what happens. And then I was at Christmas. We were celebrating Christmas, and I'm at playing a game at a table, and my sister-in-law, she says, "Is this your book?" This is Walt Brown in the beginning. "Is this your book?" And I said, "Yeah, that's my book." And she goes, "It has the answers." And I said, "Yeah, I know. It's a great book." And she said, "I love science." That's awesome. And she said she got kicked out of youth group when she was in 6th grade because she asked about dinosaurs. And I said, "You're kidding." And she said, "No." And I said, "Well, what did they say?" And she said, they told her that her questions were hurting the faith of the other students, and they kicked her out. So this is the 3rd time that dinosaurs have been a stumbling block for Christians. And, dinosaurs, that's the gateway to evolution. Evolution's the gateway to atheism. And so we have to take the dinosaurs back. So just so in case people don't know what's happening, or dinosaurs, they were land animals. So they were made on day 6 with the other land animals. And then 2 of every kind of dinosaur got on the ark. They were young ones, so they could get in the door. And then the flood came and killed all the rest of them and all the other people outside the ark, and some of them turned into fossils because they got buried. And then they got off the ark, and people called them dragons. And when I said dragons, you could see that her eyes just light up. The light bulb went on. Oh yeah, these are dragons. And then I said, and people killed them, and they carved them in castles and temples and canyons. So that's the real story about dinosaurs. And the church we're really dropping the ball on that. But and then this book here, look at this. How much do you think this was worth? Try to get this on Amazon, $250. It's a $30 book. It's going for $250. And so, that's all my college books. Man, I spent $215 on 2 books, and I thought, well, I'll just sell them back at the end of this quarter or semester. They'd give me $10 for one and nothing for the other. And so that was a bad investment. But this is a good investment, But people want it. And then there was another one. This one was a 2008 copyright. This one's a 1995 copyright. And I had a screenshot on December 26 where it was going for $480. It's like, wow. And then I had a problem with my computer and lost it. And now on December 26 it's $91. And these are used. So this theory has a lot of value to a lot of people. And so we did the week of Hydroplate, the Hydroplate week of celebration. If you want to see what happened at that, that week, we made a new channel for it. This came out of that week of celebration. Justin Wilson made this.
What if the major geological structures of Earth, its mountains, ocean basins, canyons, and fossils, could be explained by a single catastrophic event? What if one theory could tie them all together? In this documentary, we explore the hydroplate theory, the idea that before the flood, a massive ocean was trapped beneath Earth's crust, sealed beneath a thick layer of rock, and compressed under unimaginable pressure. According to this model, the day the crust finally ruptured along a global fault line, the subcrustal ocean didn't just leak out, it erupted. Water blasted upward through the cracks in colossal walls of water and superheated vapor, shooting with such force that much of it actually exceeded Earth's escape velocity. These violent jets, called the fountains of the deep, tore apart the crust, releasing the pressure that held the continents stable. As the water escaped, the crust fractured into enormous blocks, or hydroplates, which began sliding across a lubricated, water-rich base. Their rapid movement reshaped the entire planet. Mountains rising from compressional collisions, ocean basins forming where plates sank, and vast sediment layers burying organisms across entire continents. The hydroplate theory proposes that Earth's defining features were not carved slowly over millions of years, but in a short, catastrophic sequence triggered by the planet's own internal structure. This film will examine how such an event could occur, whether the evidence matches the theory, and why this model challenges the traditional timeline of Earth's history.
Yes, that's Justin Wilson. He made that, and just an incredible job. He wants to make a full-length film, and so we've got a Give, Send, Go page called Hydroplate Action. If people want to help, get the hydroplate into society, and you go into Give, Send, Go, and then Hydroplate Action. And this is a fighter pilot. I mean, I got to interview all these people. I never knew them before, and then you interview them, and they're just the neatest guys.
When I was trained as a fighter pilot, the F-16, I was given training, I was given weapons that were both defensive and offensive in nature. And with the defensive weapons, I could help ensure my survival so that I could use the offensive weapons to complete the mission that I was given. And with the hydroplate theory, I was given very powerful weapons that I came to trust because I saw how successful they were in getting people's attention. Particularly, we're flying over the Grand Canyon. And I can point out the funnel, and that's the breach point of one of the first two lakes that breached to rapidly form the Grand Canyon. But as we take off out of San Diego, you're going to be looking at the debris field. And that's where 2,800 cubic miles of rock, sediment, sand was deposited by these massive sheets of water, which explains where that material went, that the conventional explanation of the Colorado River simply can't explain it. And it's great to be able to pop up at high altitude and be able to see that. And that's one of the perspectives that I have that a lot of people don't, is a lot of my witnessing was done at 35,000 feet.
And then he goes on to say how we're not equipping the people in the battle. We've got this theory that makes accurate predictions, and the people in the battle don't have it, so they're very limited on defending their faith and attacking the lies of Satan. And then he goes on to talk about, and then one of the claims about Walt Brown, and you'll see this later in one of the emails, well, Walt Brown's not a geologist. Well, yeah, he studied under Bob Dietz. He's the guy who coined the term seafloor spreading. He's the guy who's one of the big hitters in plate tectonics. And he took classes at Arizona State so we could learn from him. And then they met every Wednesday for a couple hours and they discussed their theories. And I thought, what a great example. People with competing theories are friends. And I think that's the example that we need to get. We need to start working together. And this is the guy who made that video, Justin Wilson. And he got some of that footage out at Grand Canyon, and just a super guy.
This explanation of the flood needs to be more out there. I think it should be the mainstream view because, I think it's the truth. That's some of the bit bias there. It explains so much logically, like scientifically, theologically. The hydroplate theory is very broad and it explains so much, not just on Earth as far as like how our Earth looks, but also why the moon is the way it is, why Mars is the way it is, why there's so many asteroids and comets out there. I don't see that many creation theories or hypotheses that like encapsulates all that. As I debate atheists and they always ask for evidence, I would say the best evidence for the Bible, the loudest evidence is the evidence of the flood, because you can see that everywhere you look. Eventually, as I delved deeper into listening to the explanation of the hydroplate theory by Brian Nichol, once I started listening to that and I was just listening like every single step, all the science. Listen, just I had to even go into chemistry to understand everything he was explaining. Um, that's when I was just 100% convinced of this.
And that's true. Those other theories, they can't hold a candle to the hydroplate with all the things that the hydroplate is predicting. And this isn't a highlight. This is Mike Snavely. He talks about, and you can hear these interviews there. We broke them into segments. He's taught Sunday schools, and it grew to over 200 people. Wouldn't you like your Sunday school to reach 200? Well, hey, give him a theory that makes accurate predictions. And then he got done, and they asked him to do it again. And this is Ellen McHenry, and she teaches. And she says kids love the hydroplate. And what she's doing here, there's a three-dimensional map there. She's holding it up to the kids, and she asks them, kids, what do you think happened here? And then a little kid said, and he goes to the Pacific Ocean. He says, it looks like somebody had a big fist and punched the Pacific Ocean. And she goes, you're right. That's what happened, except it came from the inside. It got sucked down. It wasn't hit from the outside. But very intuitive. Adam R. Rakowski, he says that seminaries are infected with modernism. You know, that's where we're really dropping the ball. We got seminaries who are teaching that God didn't say, do what he said. And so that's got to change. And then Major Coleman, this is the one I started out the week with. He's a professor at New York University, or a college, I think, in New York, and he was hooting and hollering about, you know, the creation model and the hydroplate, and there was $20,000 he'd give anybody who earned a PhD in science to get in a written debate with Walt Brown. And nobody showed up to claim the money. You know, they can talk big in the classroom, but when somebody calls them into the ring to defend it, they don't show up. And Walt Brown says, yeah, you can watch to see who's willing to get in a scientific debate. And the evolutionists didn't do it, and we can't even get CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics people, to have a roundtable discussion, you know, with the strengths and weaknesses of each theory. They won't look at that. Okay, so why was a biblical theory that makes accurate predictions ignored for decades? This thing has been around since the 70s, and it's been ignored my whole life. And so why is that? Well, Jane Albright, she looked at all the documents, and she interviewed a lot of the creationists, and this is what she said.
He tried to figure out, you know, what is this about? This makes so much sense. You know, it agrees with the Bible, it agrees with physics. You know, why are these big creation organizations not excited to embrace a theory that can equip us, especially our students going to school, with arguments against evolution, and even, you know, in the Christian church community, arguments to get, well, there was no global flood and that sort of thing. Where we are today is just a lot of resistance to the hydroplate theory because, one, it's such a paradigm shift from you know, the accepted paradigm of the Earth's crust and so forth. And then also some things that were said about him personally that were untrue, that damaged his reputation and caused people to turn away from his work, unfortunately. So Kevin tried to, you know, deal with that in a biblical manner without much success, really, over the years. But Walt just kept pushing through and has made some remarkable work, you know, done even since then.
And the Kevin that she's referring to is Pastor Kevin Lee from Port Orchard, Washington. And he came across these documents. And this, I think, is the most powerful part of the whole week. I think his interview is so key, and then this part of his interview is so powerful.
Walt Brown got blackballed a long time ago, back in the 90s. One geologist plagiarized Dr. Brown's work. This geologist, when confronted by people saying, hey, you're saying what Dr. Brown said. And then he responded, well, yeah, he took my stuff. So he accused Walt. And now he never admitted this, but there was multiple witnesses to the fact that that was true. Walt Brown wrote the head of a creationist organization that had the geologist as an employee. I read all the correspondence. It's all documented on my website. If you don't fix it yourself, then I'm going to go public unless you agree to binding arbitration. They agreed to binding arbitration. And then the day before binding arbitration, after talking to their lawyers of the creation organization, the lawyer said, you don't want to do binding arbitration.
Wow.
Tell them you'll only do mediation. and the mediator determined that the geologist was supposed to set the record straight by putting an errata sheet in his book. He refused to do so. It's really a very convoluted story. Then somebody spread the rumor that you'll hear today and the other leaders of the creationist organization, Walt doing mediation. What they didn't say he came to do mediation with us because we plagiarized some of his stuff and he told us to stop it because it was affecting other people's ministry. They said he was going to sue the creation or Christian creation organization. Everywhere I'm going, I'm talking to major creationists. What about the hydro? I mean, haven't you heard about the hydroplate theory? Why aren't you communicating it? They're poisoned by this whole idea that Walt was the bad guy to ask for mediation on plagiarizing his material. And see, and I'm still oblivious to this. And so I read the letter to Walt. I go, Walt, what are they talking about? Well, that's just that he still wouldn't tell me. So then Walt says, well, then he came clean. He says, well, I can send you all the documentation if you want. I go, what? And he goes, there was a mediation and everything else. And Brian, I'm literally in crisis mode because I'm thinking he's hidden something from me.
Yeah.
He's a bad guy and he's hidden something from me.
Sure.
And so then I get this thick package and I sit down, I spread all these letters out in chronological order and I read them. And I was shocked. At how horribly mistreated Dr. Brown was, and how unrepentant, unapologetic, unchristian these bigwigs were, these creation ministry bigwigs were. I mean, it just blew me away. I mean, it just shattered.
And that's a can of worms that they don't want to open. And so
Yeah.
they just kick it under the curb and ignore it.
Well, when I did find out that instead of Walt being the plagiarizer, it was a geologist, famous geologist, and that they had lied about Dr. Brown and slandered him, then I decided, okay, I'm going to do what the Bible says. I'm going to go to him personally. You've sinned against me. You've sinned against the creation movement. Here's all the documentation. I took all the documentation and, narrated it with all the letters back and forth. And I sent it to the geologist, certified mail, and telling him I was going to do so, and I wanted him to correct any errors if he wasn't going to repent, then I was going to do what the Bible says and tell it to the church. And so then the certified mail got returned to me without opening. He didn't open it. And so I go, okay. And so then I published it at our website, that telling the whole story of trying to get the hydroplate theory communicated, at least get a hearing instead of being blackballed. How do we get past this? One, it would be for the geologist especially to come clean.
Yeah.
Organizations to come clean, for them to maybe even listen to this and realize, wow, I was told slanderous lies about Dr. Brown. I mean, I thought he was going to sue this creation organization. If I could pastorally talk to any of these guys, I would say, and you ought to do it before you die.
Exactly.
Before the guy that has a lot more than my documentation.
Exactly.
He's looked inside your head and knows the motivation.
that's, that's why we're bringing this up, where they can still clean their conscience before they
Yeah.
have to give, before
Yeah.
they have to give an account.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want that on my conscience. And we're giving them an opportunity to get it off of their conscience.
Exactly.
So it's kind of sad what happened there. And I think that's one of the reasons why the hydroplate theory is censored. They don't want to deal with what happened in the past. And, there's all those documents and they're available online. I read them online and people can see that. But if you want to see what actually happened, you can go into hydroplate.org and hit hydroplate resource, and then go down to hydroplate controversy, and then you're going to go to this timeline. And it's a really neat timeline where you can see what happens in order, and you see 1994, it's all bunched up there. So you can hit the magnifying glass and it'll spread it out. And then you can just click on it and you're going to get the document. And then you can do the next document. There's arrows, so you can go all the way through. And otherwise you can just go to this HPT doc list. Boom, there they are. There's 3 pages of them. The second one is Dr. Walt Brown's first letter to the geologist. And so we're going to take a look at, this is what he said the very first time. He said, "For 3 years I've become increasingly puzzled and disturbed by calls from many people who allege that you claim I have plagiarized your work. Is this true? According to them, you are saying that I stole your ideas that Grand and Hopi Lakes overflowed and carved the Grand Canyon. I hope these individuals misunderstood your comments," because that's what Walt Brown was preaching about years earlier. And then he heard that this guy was saying the same thing and he ignored it. And then he heard that they were stealing it. But anyhow, let's go on. And so this is the geologist's letter back to him. Enclosed is the April 1989 version of the tour guidebook, copyright 1988. Down at the bottom, these publications would appear to prove that I am the first creationist to propose the breach dam theory for the origin of Grand Canyon. And then Walt Brown, he looks through that thing and he says, having a 1988 copyright on a book that was slightly modified and published in 1989 reminds one of backdating a letter or check. Because in the 1988 copyright book, they have 1989 information in it. And then the geologist said, "Oh, I guess I put that date in there by mistake." And so then you heard how they were going to do arbitration, and that fell apart, and they did mediation. So here's Walt Brown's notes from the mediation. "I have never gotten upset when someone fails to reference my work or even when they claim it as their own and copyright it. When this happens, I consider it a compliment. However, if someone does this and hear others working with him announce that I stole it, that I must act. This means hitting the priority issue head on." Because if this was all about priority, they would have done it years earlier. Okay, but reputations and persons' effectiveness are easily damaged by such loose talk, especially when the allegations are made behind your back. And the judge asked him, "Well, what do you think should happen?" He said, "Well, no one should dispute the name Grand Lake. I gave it that name in the summer of 1989, and the geologist used it from 1990 until his new book came out 6 weeks ago." So they're both using the name, but now he calls it Canyonlands Lake. And I was in a museum somewhere and I saw Canyonlands. It's like, where does that come from? And then down at the bottom, one of the mediators asked if I could guess why the geologist suddenly came up with a different name. And we chuckled, and I said I had no idea, but couldn't get into his mind to be sure. Or I had an idea, but couldn't get into his mind. And Peter said he wanted to distance himself from your ideas. And I nodded in concurrence. Okay, so this is what happened at the mediation. The first step in the process was for me to draft an errata sheet to be placed in all unsold copies of the geologist's latest book on the Grand Canyon. And then if there's less than 1,000 copies of the books remained, it could wait until the next edition. So the number of books is important. And we're going to come back to that after we finish this up. And then he also had notes here. He says, I asked the geologist if he had recently mailed a letter asking for criticism of me. The geologist looked puzzled and said he had not. I looked him in the eye and waited for a few seconds and said that he had done so. A few more seconds of silence passed. You even sent a draft of what you wanted said, but asked him to put it in his own words. You suggested it say, Walter Brown had taken work belonging to others and some people were bothered by it. Finally, you said, there was no need to contact Walter Brown. More silence, while I decided whether I should mention my source of information. You sent such a letter to X. The geologist said that he had made a phone call to X, and I contradicted the geologist, saying, no, you sent a letter, and that letter was read to me over the phone. I repeated the gist of the letter. The geologist finally agreed that he had. I asked him why he had not contacted me first, if he had felt I'd done something wrong. And the geologist did not answer. I told him doing so would be the biblical approach, and he might have been surprised had he done so. Then I asked the geologist's boss, were you aware that the geologist was doing this? And the boss stammered, but didn't answer. This spoke volumes. Then I said, this is an example of derogatory and damaging things from your organization being spread about me. Finally, with a puzzled look on his face, the boss seemed to recall hearing about some contact being made with X. And the geologist then told us what X said. Again, I had to contradict the geologist. X only declined to make a statement. I know because X sent me a copy of this letter, of his letter back to you. And the geologist was silent. And the geologist had been caught lying. I didn't dwell on it, but everyone in the room heard it. I've always been impressed with how sincere the geologist sounds when denying any wrongdoing, even with the evidence of his false statements in front of him. His denials have always sounded so convincing that I wondered if somehow the evidence was wrong, or if he had fooled himself. It is always best to follow the evidence. And so he's got this notes, and he sends it to all the people that were in the mediation thing, and he wanted them to correct any misinformation. And nobody contacted him saying it was wrong. Okay, now we're going back to the books. If there's 1,000 books or more, an errata sheet needs to be made. Okay, this is from June 21st, 1994. In the presence of the mediator, the geologist asked if we could omit the errata sheet that he was to place in his book. And the geologist's reason was that he would publish a new edition soon with the corrections. Brown proposed that the errata sheet would be omitted only if there were less than 1,000 copies of the book remained. Everyone agreed. Everyone agreed. So now he's trying to figure out how many books there are. So then a couple weeks later, Brown wrote and asked, how many books are there? And then 2 weeks after that, he gets a response saying, the first printing of my book will soon be exhausted. So he didn't get a number. And so weeks go back and forth, back and forth. Then in August, like a month later, they counted the number of books on the warehouse, only 750 copies. And he says, the number of books in the warehouse is not what's important. How many books are there? Okay, and then finally, long story short, go down to the bottom, September 27th, this is months in the doing. Brown called the geologist and asked if he would join Brown in a conference call to the business manager and ask how many books remained. And the geologist was adamant, I will not. Brown said that he would then call the manager himself. And the geologist said that the manager would tell Brown that it's none of his business, none of your business. And so then the next day, Brown called the manager and explained why he needed to know how many copies remained. And the manager said that there were more than 1,100 books that remained. So there should have been an errata sheet printed, but it never happened for whatever reason. So that kind of goes away. And now, 12 years later, Pastor Kevin Lee gets involved in this, and he writes to the organization that he was, that's kind of responsible for this. He says, greetings in the name of our precious Savior and soon coming King Jesus. I want to start by saying how encouraged I was during our lunch meeting on June 6, 2006, where we discussed creation ministry issues and Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory. So this guy says, we discussed the idea that the truth must be our primary objective. Only the truth honors God. And then he got a response from that organization that says, it is not in our best interest to carry out your recommendations. And so that was that one. And then there's this kid named Jeremy. He writes that organization and says, do you know Walt Brown? And he got a letter back saying the organization doesn't have an official position about Walt Brown's science. And then but it goes on at the bottom to say that Dr. Brown is a physicist engineer, not a geologist or even a geophysicist. So again, he's not a geologist. That comes back. And then it says his ideas look very impressive to someone not trained, but believe me, they are utterly laughable to one who has any training in geoscience. So that's what they're saying about his theory. And so then Jeremy writes back to his credit, and he says, I must say that the fact that your organization critiques would begin by saying something about Walt Brown's credentials as alarming, instead of it seems wiser to talk about his theory. Okay? And so then they get back to him and say, oh, you're mistaken. You're amiss in your idea that we attacked Dr. Brown, and then they did this stuff, and they said some nice things about him. And then it goes down and says, his ideas look very impressive to someone not trained, ... in geoscience. So he's quoting from a previous letter, but that ... speaks volumes. And so then Jeremy writes back again, and he shows them what's missing in the ... His ideas look very impressive to someone not trained, ... But believe me, they are utterly laughable to one who has any training, ... in geophysics. And he says, Jeremy writes, is it just me, or does all this look very deceptive? So that's what's happening there. And then he writes another organization, Pastor Lee's letter, and it says that in our conversation you told me that you were unaware of the prior accusations that so-and-so had plagiarized. And it goes down, it says, you asked me to summarize my concerns and send them to you for you to forward to your legal department. So Pastor Lee sends him all the documents. This is on March 14th, 2008. Well, 2009 rolls by. Nothing happens. And then the summer of 2009, nothing happens. So he sends a letter to the top dog at that creation organization and says, you've become involved in this dispute because your museum and other products of yours are featuring the plagiarized material. My detailed letter to so-and-so on March 14th, 2008 is a letter he requested, but was ignored. And so they don't want to deal with it. And then this is correspondence with the geologist. And this is Pastor Lee. He called up the geologist on September 1st, 2009 at his home, and he answered, and then the geologist answered the call and identified myself as Pastor Kevin Lee from Calvary Church of Port Orchard. He responded, hey, I got to go. Sorry, bye, and hung up. And then a little over a month later, he, on October 10th, he had a face-to-face meeting with the geologist during a lunch break for the Seattle Creation Conference. I introduced myself as Pastor Kevin Lee and stated that I had heard from a friend that the geologist wanted to talk with me, and that now was a good time if he agreed. The following were highlights of the conversation. He asked what we could talk about. I said we could start by discussing the need for him to come clean on his plagiarism, which is resulting in bad science. He did not deny the plagiarism. I contended that this issue was he continued that the issue was a matter of hearsay and gossip. I countered that it was not, and that it was all documented at our website using the geologist's own letters and words to prove his plagiarism and bad science displayed there. Okay, the geologist stated that he and Brown had signed an agreement about this dispute, implying that everything had been settled between him and Brown. I countered that a final resolution agreement was never signed and that the dispute was not resolved because the geologist refused to correct the record. The geologist then clarified that he and Dr. Brown had both signed the mediation agreement. I agreed, but pointed out that he then quickly violated the agreement by refusing to put an errata sheet in his unsold books, and also refused to change the name of Canyonlands Lake back to Grand Lake, which was the name he plagiarized from Dr. Brown and used in his own publication for over 2 years. Okay, and then the geologist countered that the mediator only recommended that he change the name to Grand Lake. I then reminded him that the mediator's first letter directed him to change the name to Grand Lake because it was Brown who discovered and named it. But after the first letter, the geologist bombarded the mediator with pages of federal requirements pertaining to the naming of lakes, which don't apply to extinct lakes. Only then did the mediator defer. Okay, but again, told the geologist that he thought the geologist should change the name of the lake to Grand Lake. I challenged him that his use of the federal requirements about the lake names was nothing more than a ploy to cover up his plagiarism. He did not refute the statement. He made an attempt to deflect my concerns by making additional false statements, which I countered with facts as documented in his own letters. I told him I was going to be informing 200 creation organizations about our posted documentation. He stated, "You know more about this than I do," and walked off. So this is what Pastor Lee's attempt to do, and there is some headway being happened. That was in 2009, I believe, and this is in 2023, so 14 years later. HPT takes center stage at an organization, creation organization, and you can hear about this at rsr.org, and the date is May 19th, and Pastor Lee was invited into a creation organization to present the hydroplate theory. And so there is hope. And he talks about it in his interview, the guy who invited him in, he says, hey, this is to fix an injustice. So there's people at the top who know what happened and they want to fix it, but there may be resistance inside the organization to keep it from being fixed. And so is it still happening today? Yeah, this happened last week. This is a post from Answers in Genesis. Churches should stand on the Bible, not feelings. And I posted, yeah, I agree. Churches should also reject secular ideas like evolution and plate tectonics. Why is a biblical theory that makes accurate predictions ignored? See, I put plate tectonics on the same level as evolution. They got just as much biblical support, and that they're secular models. Evolution is a secular model. They slap a cross on it and they say it's theistic evolution and try and squeeze it in the Bible. Plate tectonics is a secular model and they speed it up and say it's catastrophic plate tectonics and try and squeeze it into the Bible. And yet we have a theory that makes accurate predictions where we don't need any one of those theories. And so that's what I posted, and then a creation director, he's not from AIG, but he's from an organization, a smaller one. He says, just a heads up to anyone unfamiliar with young Earth creation beliefs, nearly all creationists believe in plate tectonics, as do the geologists and scientists who work for the leading creation organizations. Mr. Lauer does not speak on behalf of the creation community, and we do not support such fringe theories. Neither does Answers in Genesis support the idea of hydroplate theory for its many scientific problems and overstatement of claims. So I responded, you are speaking very authoritatively. How much of Dr. Walt Brown's book did you read? That's an important question. Do you know what you're talking about? If you haven't read it, you are just going on hearsay. Okay, and he said, what are the many scientific problems with HPT? Because that happened to me. I heard a creationist speak one time, and he said that during Q&A, I asked him about hydroplate, and he said it doesn't work, and I asked him why not, and he says it breaks laws of physics, and I asked him which laws of physics, and he said, I don't know, but the geologists I know don't go along with it. So these geologists on top, who have their own models, are cutting the legs out from Walt Brown, and everybody's believing it. And so I go on to say, are you aware of the scientific problems with subduction? See the page, and I gave him a place to go where he could see what the problems with it. And then once again, why is a biblical theory that makes accurate predictions and is validated by NASA discoveries ignored? And then I requote some of his sentences with my spin on it. Just a heads up for anyone unfamiliar with past groupthink, nearly all creationists once believed in the canopy theory too. Hence, we do not appeal to authority or majority to determine truth, and that's what he did. Those are both logical fallacies. You appeal to the majority and the authority, but that's not how you do it. Shouldn't people see both flood models and think for themselves instead of presenting one model as dogma and calling the other one fringe? I mean, let people think about it instead of just excluding it and poisoning the well. And then, by the way, what accurate predictions have been made by using CPT? And I emailed one of the big hitters, probably the biggest hitter for CPT, and asked him that question, and he said, we don't make predictions. And I asked, what biblical support does CPT have that distinguishes it from other flood models? I asked the big hitter that question too, and he said Genesis 6, 7, and 8, which are just the flood chapters. That's any flood model. Okay? And then I said, well, it would be interesting to see which creation organization allows people to think about flood models first. And that's the challenge I have. Which museum is going to allow people to think? You need to see both sides if you want to think, otherwise you're just seeing one side and memorizing. And so we'll see. I think the organization that does that first is going to, there are people in future generations that are going to look back to, those are the leaders. Those guys could lead us. Okay, this is what Walt Brown says in his book. A subducting plate would experience too much resistance in driving down through just the top of the mantle. See, they got plate tectonics. There's not enough sediment in the ocean for millions of years. So they say that must have got recycled. It gets subducted. And this is their theory. The blunt front end alone would stop movement. Also, the unspecified force needed to overcome these resistances would, if a pushing force, crush the plate, or if a pulling force, pull the plate apart. Okay, so it's not going to work, and there's a whole bunch more. And this is rather eye-opening, too.
You know, I was trained as an engineer, and, you know, I don't think I ever took a geology class. And so I really didn't know what the field entailed. But it just really, again, it seemed like all these people with advanced degrees in geology, right? But as I talked to them, I really had a hard time getting to discuss to even some of the more basic technical issues, like why subduction can't happen.
Right.
Because of the strength of granite and what happens under pressures, and how it really, you can't slide granite. You can't, a simple force diagram shows that doesn't happen. And people that I talked to, just their eyes would just glaze over. So maybe I shouldn't even talk about this, but I did my own little deep dive, and I started digging into, well, what do geology schools actually teach? So I started pulling up top geology schools, and I looked at the coursework. What do you have to study to take? And I was shocked at how little real hard science there is in those curriculum.
Really?
A lot of observational stuff, a lot of stuff around minerals and dirt and stuff like that. Not a lot of physics, chemistry, strength of materials, energy, fluid flow, things that you kind of need to know about if you're going to study something so dynamic and catastrophic as a global flood. They don't study those things.
Yeah, and I think that's why Walt had the advantage. He understood energy and mechanisms and forces, and he looked at it up from an engineer, and he could put it together. And it's with his accurate predictions and his NASA discoveries.
So I just throw that out because if people shouldn't be intimidated because geologists don't believe in it or whatever.
Yeah. And so we don't have to be intimidated by the degree. When I did that Hydroplate Week of celebration, I had 3 goals. One, I was going to honor Walt Brown. And the way I was going to do that, I want to get this into the next generation, because if we don't get it into the next generation, it's going to fade into history, and all his work will just go by, and that's going to be a crying shame. And we can't account, the secular scientists aren't going to do it, and it appears like the creation scientists aren't going to do it. So this has to be a grassroots movement. That was the intent of that week. Number 2, I wanted to give people an opportunity to think. You need to see both models if you want to think. And then number 3 is the hydroplate protocol. I want to have, and Walt Brown, he writes about this, he says that before a paper gets published, they should make predictions. Every paper should have predictions to see if what they're thinking is right. And especially accurate predictions. And so that's what I submit. Before somebody, or actually when you hear people speak, it's like, hey, what predictions have you made using that theory? Which ones are accurate? Which ones do you currently have? And if they don't have predictions, Walt Brown says that's weak science. That shows they don't have confidence in their theory. And he hits the ball out of the park on a lot of these. And here's another AIG post. As Christians, we use the Bible as the standard. And I said, Christian scientists ignore the Bible when it comes to flood models. A biblical theory that makes accurate predictions is rejected in favor of a secular model sped up. And it's going to be interesting to see how they answer that. They're not using the Bible for plate tectonics. They're not. And so, in Walt Brown, and this is kind of why I'm doing this, and then in Walt Brown's mediation notes, he brings up the 7 habits of highly effective people, which describes 3 levels of increasing maturity. First, it's dependence. Second, it's independence. And finally, third, it's interdependence. When you can work together, that's the highest form of maturity. And it's the boss and the geologist and I were independent, but we could accomplish much more if we were interdependent. Could you imagine if those museums were had a display of all the accurate predictions of a biblical theory? How popular that display would be, and how equipped the people would be coming out of those museums to stand up to the evolutionists? Could you imagine that? So if they would use Walt's ideas in their distribution system, their megaphone, man, I think it's game over. If we can get these 2 to work together, Big Bang's done. Because the Big Bang and their predictions are always wrong, and Walt Brown's predictions and NASA discoveries are on the money. And so that's what I'm trying to do, and they aren't working together because of this issue. They keep kicking it under the rug, and so I'm bringing it to the surface so they can deal with it, and hopefully there can be some reconciliation. And we aren't looking to tar and feather anybody. We just want this to be dealt with so that people can work together, and also so people have clear consciences too. And so that's the motivation. And then down at the bottom, or that second line at the end of the paragraph, the geologist said he wished that non-geologists, meaning me, would stay out of his business. You know, it's the ultimate of groupthink. You know, you're elitism. You don't have the degree, so we don't care what you think. And Major Coleman, teaches in the law school. He says that's like saying if you don't understand law, you can't vote. You know, and so this is the mindset that has to go away. And so I wrote a letter to the editor of a peer-reviewed creation journal. They had an article that came out that said why it talked about olivine in the asteroids and comets, and it says, well, it can't come from the mantle. It can't be in basalt. So they were using an outdated book to make this claim. We don't say it was basalt, we say it's mantle now. But they won't know it because we're slow at getting the books published, so that's part on us too. And so they said that, and so I wrote the letter. And I said, Dear blank, thank you for the article, in your fall edition. In the writer's attempt to show a flaw in the hydroplate theory, he actually brought up another confirmed prediction by Dr. Walt Brown. Why didn't the writer mention that Dr. Brown predicted olivine would be found in comets and asteroids at least 5 years before NASA discovered it? Because I went into ChatGPT and I said, when did Walt Brown predict olivine and comets? And it said 2001 and before. And then it said NASA discovered it in 2005. And so there's another accurate prediction, but the writer ignores it. And this brings us to the elephant in the room. Why was a biblical flood model that makes accurate predictions ignored for decades? Why is a biblical theory that is validated by NASA discoveries disregarded in favor of a theory that doesn't make predictions or have specific biblical support? Why do authors neglect to mention the astoundingly accurate predictions made using the hydroplate theory? And I gave them a link, and I said, Walt Brown offered $10,000 to anyone with an earned PhD degree to participate in a written debate. Nobody accepted. Not even the creationists who were maligning him. And Standing for Truth Ministries on YouTube has an open microphone for anyone who wants to participate in a roundtable discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of each theory. But CPT experts decline this invitation. We've been trying to put this together for over a year, and they come up to excuse after excuse. And so we finally just had a hydroplate seminar instead of a roundtable discussion. And Dr. Thomas Chamberlain wrote a famous paper over 100 years ago. He argued that there should always be multiple working hypotheses so people could sharpen their analytical skills, think critically, and compare and contrast. Otherwise, people just memorize and conform. Only presenting one theory as dogma is what the evolutionists do. Christians should have a higher standard. Since there are two flood models, they should both be presented fairly so people can think critically instead of just memorize. Hopefully, creation organizations and museums will set the example and lead us out of the dark ages of consensus science. It'll be interesting to see who will be the first to let my people think about flood models. Yeah, that's all we're asking. Well, just let people think, you know, and then the consensus science, that's a train wreck. We saw what happened in COVID. You know, the consensus, you got to have the consensus, and those can be corrupt as can be. And now we're seeing there's even the consensus science in creation models with the flood. You know, nearly all the creationists believe in plate tectonics, and all these, that's the consensus. Let's look at the theory, and what I'd really like is let's compare accurate predictions. And so that was asked, is there headway being made? And yeah, I was just interviewed on recapping the week of celebration for Real Science Radio. They interviewed me on Tuesday. They're going to air it at KLTT in Denver, 50,000 watt blowtorch of AM radio in the Rockies. But that's going to be, I think, a week from Friday. They're going to air that. And also, this is Alex Newman. He's got a pretty big microphone, pretty big influence, and this is what he says.
I'm sure most of you learned in your government indoctrination public schools. And I learned when I was in school, not in government school, but still in indoctrination camp, that there was plate tectonics, whatever. And I had no reason to doubt that. But I was at a conference, a homeschool conference, just a few months ago. I gave the keynote talk there on some things, and I ran into a very interesting individual who said, no, plate tectonics is not really what happened. And he introduced me to this thing called the hydroplate theory. And it was so fascinating. I watched a few videos about it, and I don't know enough to know whether it's correct or not, but I know enough to know that this ought to be heard. In fact, this, to me at least, makes just as much sense, if not more, as the plate tectonics theory, and it seems to be pretty in line with the evidence and with what the Bible teaches. And after watching some of those videos and looking at some of this evidence, I agree with you. This is something that at least needs to be considered. It's something that scientists need to look at and come up with some explanations for.
I would strongly suggest Real Science Radio, rsr.org. I've been listening to the Walt Brown interviews. Going to rsr.org/HPT, you see this cover, and then there's a 9th edition button underneath it, and you can click it and download it for free. Yeah, they changed that. The PDF's not available anymore. But the flip book is. The brand new book that's supposed to be printed whenever. I've been hearing that for years. But there's a flip book. If you go into hpt.rsr.org, there is a flip book where you can see the updated version, the one that's going to be printed. So that's still there, which is a tremendous blessing. And so I encourage people to go into the week of celebration and hear these, listen to these interviews, listen to the promos. It's amazing the support that's out there, and it's being ignored. And this is what I think needs to happen. This is one of the interviews. This is Naylor, Matt Naylor. He's from Standing for Truth Ministries. They've got 30,000 followers, and he's really good at doing debates. They're sharp as can be. They're probably, him and Donnie Badinsky are probably the best young speakers out there as far as evolution, because they do debates all the time. They're always learning, and they host the debates. But this is what he says.
These are probably the most important aspects of how we can promote something online. This is kind of like what we do over on Standing for Truth. We collaborate with others. We form a team. And when you bring together a team and more people that can think differently, you get more skills from other people. And younger people think different than older people. So you want a good age group difference, because younger people tend to live on social media much more. And so there's skills at being able to be in touch on social media. The next one would be target social media, news, and then make articles, and then any public talks that you can think of. Hydroplate theory should be taught at churches. And the main reason why is because we need to educate the parents. You see, kids might like it, but they're going to go off to school and they're not going to really know much about things. Matter of fact, that's one of the reasons we actually found that there's a massive falling away later. Content for kids, because they're the next generation. They're learning. They're like a sponge. They can retain information better than even you and I could. Practical application. They would be good to have like articles and things out there for people to come across. And so that's where we're at. And if people want to see some of these documents, it's fascinating, really. It really is. You go into hydroplate.org and hit the hydroplate resources, and then go down to see hydroplate controversy. And then also up here it says the document list, HPT document list, and they're all right there. And if you notice, we didn't name any names. I didn't mention any organizations, because we don't want that to bias anybody. We want you to look at the situation and say, okay, if this happened, what should happen to make it right? And then you can go in and look at, see who it is. And then it could be like that Nathan and David, thou art the man. It's maybe this could happen, and we can help this. So let's see, where are we at? We'll, we're going to wrap this up real quick. And the main thing is, here we go. We want a decentralized creation movement. We can't wait for the gatekeepers to let us think about flood models. They're not going to let us think at this point in time. We have to think on our own. So it's going to be non-centralized. We aren't going to wait for whoever speaks for the creation community, like that director said. And there's a Give, Send, Go page for Hydroplate Action, and where we can get some funding to have conferences, make videos, make movies. And then I'm putting together a team. It's called the Hydroplate. It's called hydroplateteam@gmail.com.
hydroplateteam@gmail.com. This is people from whatever to use whatever skills that they can to help the hydroplate get into the mainstream, because when it gets into the mainstream, we're going to get rid of this consensus science dark ages, and we're going to destroy the Big Bang. And so that's what we're looking for. And I encourage everybody, if you don't do anything else tonight, just go into hydroplate.org and click here to subscribe for the e-newsletter. That's something that's new. It's going to come out every month or two. So then you'll know what's coming. You'll know when the book's available. You'll know when the conferences are. You'll know when another NASA discovery comes about. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for, just people that basically, it shouldn't be controversial. Let people think about flood models. Don't teach one as dogma and call the other one fringe. That's not science. And so with that, thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate that. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, wait. Yeah, yes. Ray.
This geologist is quite elderly. Do you think when he dies, the organizations will be more reasonable about this, or are they so invested in believing what's not true?
Well, it makes me think of that saying, science advances one funeral at a time. And, and that's what, he was invited in, Randy Galuza, he's the president of ICR. I have so much respect for him. When he took over, he said, he's been advised to promote the ICR brand. He says, I'm not doing that. I'm promoting creation. And he's the guy who invited Pastor Lee to come in and talk to his scientists for 4 hours. So he's the guy, I think, that he wants, people to think. He wants, basically invite him in and say, hey guys, I want you to see, what's out there. I've heard what people say about the hydroplate theory people. I'd rather hear what the hydroplate people have to say. And so there's a big step right there. But that was in December 8th in 2022. And not...
Galuza studied the hydroplate theory?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he has or not, but I think he's heard about the situation, and apparently, and you can hear this in Pastor Lee's interview, he says when he introduced Lee, when he was saying, he said, this is to correct an injustice. This is to fix an injustice. And he gave Pastor Lee the microphone, which is a tremendous step forward. This dam of censorship, I think it's embarrassing for organizations and for people, and they'd rather not deal with it. But that was a small crack. That was actually a huge crack. He gave him the microphone. And so again, and Dr. Galuza is going to be speaking at Northwestern on April 21st. And so I'm celebrating, that's Dr. Galuza Day. I'm going to do whatever I can to get as many people there as possible. So that's something our club could think about carpooling down there. On April 21st, I'll speak at 7 o'clock at the University of Northwestern. I'm going to be doing a creation tour at the Como Zoo because International Community Science Creation Association or whatever, they were going to do a homeschool blast for people who are doing creation tours. And it's like, okay, I want every homeschooler in this area to be at Como Zoo so I can tell them about Randy Galuza that night. I want to pack that room for Randy because he is the shining star. He's the example that's standing up. He wants it to be truth. And Pastor Lee was he was on a trip with Randy Galuza. It was a Grand Canyon trip, if I understand this right, and it's at Horseshoe Bend. They're watching the sunset or something. He's talking to Randy Galuza. I might have that part wrong, but he said, wouldn't it be great if we could unite around truth? If all the Christians would unite around truth. And Randy Galuza was in agreement with that. Okay, and so, it's got to be a grassroots thing. And so whatever you can do to get this out there, and we're going to do another week of celebration next year, the week before Thanksgiving. This one was a week after. We're going to do it before Thanksgiving so people can do their Christmas shopping. They can go into hydroplate.org, and we got merch. I don't know if you can see this. I don't know if you can see this. It says NASA scientists work for Walt Brown. And then on the back, it's got a whole bunch of accurate, things they discover, and it works for, and so then you can get coffee mugs, you get bumper stickers, all that stuff. And so then your coffee mug says, never underestimate the power of supercritical water. And that can start a conversation. And so I'm encouraging Christians to vote with their money. If you're going to buy something, buy it from God's kingdom, not man's kingdom. And if we can do that, I think we can make an impact. That was kind of a long question, long answer to a good question. Any other questions at all? Yeah, it's an exciting time we're living in. We're seeing the Big Bang fall apart. We're seeing evolution fall apart. We're seeing the origin of life fall apart. And I think we're seeing plate tectonics fall apart. And it's all pointing strongly to the Bible. And now if we can just, again, it's going to be a decentralized creation movement. We can't wait for the gatekeepers to allow us to think. We got to start thinking on our own. And that's how we beat this dark ages of consensus science. It's so frustrating. And so, yeah, they're having a creation organization creation conference down in Pensacola this year. You know, I was going to go to the one in St. Louis last year, and the guy said, don't waste your time, their minds are made up, go to the homeschoolers. So that's what I did. But this year I'm going to go. And I made a call, and it's like, there's a church that wants me to speak the Sunday after, you know. And then on the way down, Baraboo, they want me to speak, Baraboo, Wisconsin. So we're planting these seeds wherever I go, and you know, eventually there's going to be too many people asking questions about it. And it's like the emperor has no clothes. Or even Walt Brown. You know, he says, a scientific revolution seldom begins when it's opposed by the intellectual elites. You know? He says, but when a vast number of people realize they've been misled, an intellectual revolution can begin. So I'm trying to get as many people as possible to realize we've been misled. We've been misled by the evolutionists, and I believe we're being misled by the creationists with plate tectonics. And I'm just, let people think.
So if we go to hear Galuza speak in April, is it a good idea for us after the lecture to request that he look into hydroplate theory?
You know, he spoke in Cambridge, last year. And I wasn't there, but somebody brought up the hydroplate during Q&A. And he had positive things to say about it. You know, a few years ago, I talked to Randy Galuza after when he was taken down and everybody's gone. And I said, you know, I was going to ask you about the hydroplate, but I didn't want to put you on the spot. And he goes, yeah, I appreciate that. You know, so just use your, if you want, I don't know, you know. But I think just our presence there, you know, and you know, after I found out he invited Pastor Lee to speak there, I went and I heard him speak. I knew what he was going to say, but I just wanted to, I want to support him. And afterwards I said, thank you for letting the hydroplate people speak at your organization. And he said, the hydroplate theory has been marginalized for far too long. And that's true. And yet it's still meeting resistance. And so, but yeah, Randy Galuza, just top-notch guy. And the neat thing about him is he says such powerful things so gently. You know, I don't know how he does that. I got to work on that, but he's just powerful. And he knows what he's saying, he stands strong, but it's very gentle, the way he says it, very likable. So yeah, I think I would encourage, you know, that could be an outing, you know, who wants to carpool down to hear Randy Galuza. You know, it'll start at 7 o'clock. Otherwise, you can Zoom it. No, yeah, well, our tech, we're still working on our tech. You know, I was speaking down there, and and it was somebody up here, a college student, was watching it on Zoom, and then for some reason we lost our sound, so she couldn't hear it. So that's an option. So it's better to be there in person, and then you can thank Dr. Galuza personally. You know, that's something as a speaker I really appreciate encouragement. You know, because I get a lot of slings and arrows, but it's neat when people encourage you, especially if they do it personally. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this year. I think this is going to be a year of tremendous progress. I can see the hydroplate gaining traction and the whole creation movement gaining traction. And we're not taking the summer off again this year. That didn't work very well. We got to talk to a few people, but I think it's good to keep up to date on what's happening. Anyhow, well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming. And hopefully we'll see you next month.